All right. Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
My name is Jim Entz. I am professor of art here at Porterville College and the coordinator of the Cultural Historical Awareness Project, which we call CHAP. Just a little bit of background on that, and then we'll introduce the speaker and get going. So, the Porterville College Cultural Historical Awareness Program was organized in 2002 to enhance students' awareness of important aspects of our society, which they may previously have had little exposure to, or no exposure. A theme is chosen by CHAP members each school year. This year the theme is the Anthropocene, and it's actually our second year of this theme. It's a very, meaty theme, so we spent some time looking at this. We also encourage faculty members across campus to encourage their students to look at this theme, and they do this through integrating it in their courses. And also we encourage students to attend these events. And with a guest speaker or other types of presentations throughout the year that we've had, all of them are free and open to the public. So please, feel free to come to these events in the future. All right, let's start by silencing our cell phones. So if you have them, let's silence them. And for those students who would like a proof of attendance, we have these nifty tickets here. And I or somebody else will be at this door over here after the event to pass them out. So please feel free to do that. All right. Our speaker today, Arthur Obst, received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Washington in Seattle. He is a postdoctoral associate in the High Meadows Environmental Institute and University Center for Human Values. Obst's research lies at the intersection of traditional philosophy and the ongoing climate crisis. His dissertation clarifies the conceptual underpinnings of classical U.S. preservation thought with the aim of establishing its pressing social and political relevance today. He is published in Environmental Values and Environmental Ethics and is co-author of Dialogues on Climate Justice with Stephen Gardner. The title is up here. I was going to use it, but I'm sure he'll tell you about that. And I'm very pleased to present Arthur Obst. Thank you.
Is that right? Okay, testing, everyone can hear me? Okay, well, I'm very honored to be here and excited to be a part of this very cool program. Today, I will be talking to you about the Anthropocene, kind of from my angle, which you already heard briefly described from my description of my research. The title of my talk is, as you can see, Flying from History, Too Close to the Sun, the Anxious, Jubilant Futurism of Contemporary Age of Man Environmentalism. Okay, so I'll start with this little teaser quote from the environmental writer Wendell Berry, a pretty well-known figure some of you may have read. He has this quote from The Unsettling of America, one of his books, and I can't remember the year, I think maybe late 70s or early 80s. He said that what has drawn the modern world into being is a strange, almost occult yearning for the future. The modern mind longs for the future as the medieval mind longed for heaven. So he was describing a kind of broad socio-political phenomenon he was seeing at the time. And I think that this depiction of kind of, human beings and society is just as relevant today, if not more so. And it has not left environmentalism as a movement unaffected, and that's really what I'm going to talk about today. And perhaps I don't need to motivate this quite as much in California as maybe some other places, especially, this would probably be especially describing Silicon Valley and other places, but that's a little teaser. So the thesis I'm going to broadly try to convince you of in this talk is that the Anthropocene as an idea encourages an arrogant futurist outlook to environmental problems, exemplify what has been called age of man environmentalism, and that it should be resisted on these grounds. So I'll unpack that throughout this talk. So here's an outline of how I'm going to try to convince you of this thesis. I'm going to first just give some basic outlining of the Anthropocene as a scientific and purely descriptive idea, just something trying to describe the world without any political or social valence. Now this might be redundant for some of you if you especially attended some on the Anthropocene last year, but bear with me through this part at least. The second section, I'm going to be talking about this idea of the age of environmentalists and environmentalism, and giving some examples of thinkers and quotes of people that I would situate in the tradition, and also just define what this is. Then I'll talk a bit about futurism, going back to the early 20th century and the Italian futurists, and then explain how there are rhetorical parallels between that movement and how the Anthropocene has been manifest in environmental thinking today. Then I'm going to give a sort of anecdote to, I think, the problems with this rhetoric by considering whether we might perceive Henry David Thoreau, a famous American environmental thinker, kind of the linchpin, the whole progenitor of the preservation thought, arguably, as the first Anthropocene writer, as someone who was really tackling and struggling with this emergent phenomenon that we're seeing today that we are now calling the Anthropocene. And finally, I'm going to, in section 5, suggest why understanding Thoreau as an Anthropocene writer really disrupts a lot of this rhetoric of age of man environmentalism, and actually shows why we should consider the Anthropocene as a concept today as consisting in a flight from history that we should resist. Okay, so let's start with the Anthropocene. I'm going to try to leave about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. Do my best here. Okay, so the birth of the Anthropocene as a concept. So there's a who, what, who, when, and where. So the who is Paul Crutzen, who's an atmospheric scientist and a Nobel Prize winner. So in the 90s, he actually played, and even before that, he played a really important scientific role kind of educating the general public and convincing the scientific community about why we had to worry so much about ozone. And he actually played a really important role tackling that issue. And that's why he won this Nobel Prize. So this is at the turn of the century. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think in the year 2000, a lot of people were really taken by this futurist sensibility. But in February 2000, in Cuernavaca, Mexico, might be butchering that, at the 13th annual meeting of International Geosphere and Biosphere Program, he originally kind of floated this idea of the Anthropocene. So I'll just kind of quickly read a quote of like kind of how this scene happened. Will Stephan, who's another really influential scientist, atmospheric scientist, a younger person who's still alive today, he describes what happened at this meeting as follows. So scientists from the IGBP, this organization's Paleo-Environmental Project, were reporting on their latest research, and they often referred to the Holocene, and that's the most recent geological epoch of Earth history, just to set the context for their work, just table setting, as academics like to do. So Paul Crutzen was becoming visibly agitated at this usage, and after the term Holocene was mentioned yet again, he interrupted them and said, "Stop using the word Holocene. We're not in the Holocene anymore. We're in I was trying to search for the right word, the Anthropocene." So this is an outburst at a kind of meeting of academics at a conference. So that's the first, at least, recorded usage, and it took about a year or two for Crutzen to actually defend this idea in print. He did so in the journal Climatic Change, which is a pretty well-known journal of climate change, an interdisciplinary journal. And this paper was called The Geology of Mankind, and it's here where he argues that we should seriously consider that human beings, or just the planet, rather, has entered into a new epoch, the Anthropocene, literally the age of man. So just so everyone's on the same page, right, what is some basic terminology here? What is an epoch? Well, it's the smallest unit of geologic time, and it's marked by distinctive strata in the rock record. So you can see, and this is what this photo, or this image helpfully shows is that you can see different layers in the rock, in the fossil rock bed, in the sediment, and you can tell them apart, right? There's salient ways in which that you can tell them apart in the strata, which is layers of rock and sediment. And the epochs are kind of indications of those breaks, right? So recent examples of how geologists have typified or separated out different epochs by strata is by changes in the fossil record and alternating glacial spread and retreat. So that was true of the Holocene, right? This last 11.7, the 11,700 years, right, which is after the last retreat of the glaciers, that has been a relatively temperate and hospitable time for humans, which isn't a coincidence, right? A lot of people think that this distinctive kind of temperate nature of this recent epoch was particularly conducive to human activities and why helped us emerge as such a technological and successful, abundant species. So what scientists who think that we have entered a new epoch, the basic thing is to suggest that all of this human activity, which you can see at the top of this image, has really made a distinctive effort in the impacts in the geological record, in the strata, that it can actually be distinguished from everything that came before. And that this, therefore, would constitute a new epoch. So in this original paper, which was published in 2003, Paul Crutzen gave a bunch of informal indicators of why we might have entered the Anthropocene. So he pointed out that this at the time, human population is 6 billion and rising exponentially. I believe we're now at 8 billion, just put that in perspective. Methane-producing cattle population had risen to 1.4 billion. 30 to 50% of the planet's land surface had been exploited by humans. Tropical rainforests were disappearing. There was a ubiquity of dams and river diversions, which at dinner tonight I just learned is why we are currently in the climate that we are. Currently, they're not a swamp. Porterville used to be in a swamp, but thanks in part to damming, that is not the current environment in which we reside. One kind of disturbing, but also in a sense, I guess, a fun fact that you can put away is that after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Americans build an average of 1 dam a day in America. So a lot of dams out there. More than half of all accessible fresh water is being used. Energy use had grown 16-fold during the 20th century, and more nitrogen fertilizer was applied in agriculture than was fixed naturally in all terrestrial systems. So just a bunch of kind of smorgasbord of factors which Crutzen thought this is leaving evidence all over the world that we may have entered a new epoch. Now, more recently, the Anthropocene Working Group, which is an influential panel of scientists, in 2019 voted to declare the Anthropocene as their, it was now voted that their official policy of their group was that the Anthropocene was a new geological epoch, and in particular, they thought that it was marked by nuclear bomb blasts in the mid-20th century, which scattered radioactive debris around the planet that became embedded in sediments and thereby part of the geological record. Now, this has not been adopted and officially adopted more generally, but they're moving towards it. Other phenomenon that they identify with the Anthropocene is this the order of magnitude increase in erosion and sediment transport by urbanization and agriculture, marked and abrupt anthropogenic perturbations of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus cycles, global warming, sea level rise, ocean acidification, rapid changes in the biosphere as a result of habitat loss and species invasions, right? Think of sixth great extinction as well, and the proliferation and global dispersion of many new minerals and rocks, including concrete and plastic. And all of these arguably could constitute this scientific descriptive Anthropocene. Now, where they draw the line at the mid-20th century is somewhat controversial. That's on the later end. A lot of people think that you could maybe mark the Anthropocene earlier. In particular, Paul Crutzen thought that in the mid-18th century, with the invention of the steam engine by James Watt, that would actually potentially be seen as like a different point where you could say, we're now in the Anthropocene. So this is kind of distinctive by setting the line kind of where they do, and that's actually one of the biggest scientific debates right now is just where does the Anthropocene start if we're going to declare a new epoch. Okay, so that's just the scientific descriptive vision of the Anthropocene. But one thing, just for those philosophers out there, or those who've taken philosophy, or those who are interested in philosophy, one thing that you'll learn, and if you take, chances are if you take an ethics class or many philosophy classes, is the concept of Hume's guillotine. So David Hume was an 18th century philosopher, and he famously argued that you can't derive an ought, what you should do, from an is, what is just a description of the world, a scientific fact, right? So, and here's a little quote where he says that to say that something ought to be or ought not to be expresses some new relation or affirmation that purely describing the world cannot give you. And so what you might think then is that when we're talking about the Anthropocene, when we're talking about this new geological epoch, it's purely descriptive. There's no political or moral valence to this project, right? And that those who think that the Anthropocene that we have arrived in this new geologic epoch, right, that would not be predictive of any other beliefs that they might have. But one thing I'm going to kind of suggest, and I'm not the only one to suggest, is that that's not true. That those who actually, especially, become really focused and infatuated with the Anthropocene have particular kind of political projects in mind. So the concept of age of man environmentalism, right, age of man being the Anthropocene, is attributable to Ned Hettinger, who's a philosopher, and this is to a 2021 paper of his that I think came out in Ethics, Policy, and Environment. He writes that, right, well, given this descriptive scientific Anthropocene, what should we make of this human impact, right? No relevant player in this debate thinks that human beings have not made extreme impacts on the planet, right? That's not what those who might be skeptical of the Anthropocene are saying, right? The question is, well, what do we do? So Hettinger says that, well, traditional environmentalism, especially a preservationist strand, might consider the Anthropocene an assault on the natural world and just evidence that we should lessen human influence. But in contrast, what you might call age of man environmentalism argues that this massive scale of human impact requires that we give up traditional values of environmentalism. We live in an entirely new world, and we need radically new ideas that befit this new world. This means that old-fashioned goals of preservation, restoration, and respect for nature are, for the most part, passé and out of date. We have been thrust into the role of planetary managers who must engineer nature according to our values and ideals. Now, Ned Hettinger is not himself subscribing, in fact, he's very critical of what he calls age of man environmentalism, but he's describing this phenomenon that he sees. So let's survey briefly, is this really a thing out there? Well, one clear example, or kind of an early example of this sort of sentiment, right? So this is in a New York Times kind of collection of op-eds that came out 8 years after Crutzen first originally posed to the public, to a more broad audience, this idea of the Anthropocene. The kind of interdisciplinary cohort of people, Emma Maris, who wrote this popular book, Roach's Garden, Saving Poacher, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World, that some of you may have read, perhaps, and then some other kind of interdisciplinary scholars, together wrote this piece, this opinion piece called Hope in the Age of Man. In that they write, the Anthropocene does not represent the failure of environmentalism. It is the stage on which a new, more positive and forward-looking environmentalism can be built. This is the Earth we have created, and we have a duty as a species to protect it and manage it with love and intelligence. It is not ruined, it is beautiful still, and can be even more beautiful if we work together and care for it. So, note, bolded letters, that's my doing, right? This is emphasis added. So what kind of characterizes this initial appeal is saying that the Anthropocene means that we need something new out of our environmental ethics. We need something, importantly, more forward-looking. And importantly, they see that the fact that in the Anthropocene we have created the Earth in various respects means that we therefore have a derivative duty, a moral duty, a political duty, to manage it, often in a more active, interventionist way, although that goes implicit in this initial appeal. So this, I think, is early kind of whispers of what you might call a Promethean dream that coincides with a lot of Anthropocene discourse. So, especially in environmental philosophy, contemporary environmental philosophy, especially those of more preservationist valence, are often call a certain flavor of environmental policy or environmental philosophy Promethean, in the sense harkening back, right, to the Greek lore and Prometheus, who gave fire, this technique, the technology of fire, to human beings, right? This was done in such a fashion to allow human beings to kind of really manipulate and control the environment, to make their lives better off. But as punishment for stealing this fire from Mount Olympus, he was punished by having his liver eaten every single day, right? So this idea, this kind of ambition to kind of improve one's lot through technology it comes at great cost. Promethean literally means foresight. And so this idea of Prometheus and Promethean dreams also just harkens to science and reason as kind of the emphasis of value and the locus of value, as a way of kind of liberating humanity from kind of the labors of the environment. Okay. This also kind of, just as a brief aside, kind of harkens back to the idea that basically nature is very cruel, kind of like beats and tortures humanity, and so the only way to kind of do well as a species is to dominate and control nature, right? To liberate ourselves from this horrible lot that we have been given. So I think a lot of recent environmental rhetoric could be described as Promethean, and it very frequently, almost always, like, without fail, seems to invoke the Anthropocene in one way or another. Just in general, I would encourage everyone, if there's one thing to take away from this talk, is just keep an eye out. If you're looking at any op-eds or just in politics, see if there's an environmental policy, just try to keep an eye to see if they invoke the Anthropocene as a sort of kind of a blank check to say, well, we've already dominated the planet, so we have to do X, Y, or Z to fix the problem, that there's no alternative. So I'm going to give some examples, but I would just keep an eye out in your day-to-day lives. I can't unsee it. Okay, so in this book, very tellingly titled The God Species, the environmental writer Mark Linus, in this 2011 book, says that the Anthropocene does not necessarily imply any limit to human economic growth or productivity. Playing God, in the sense of being intelligent designers, at a planetary level is essential if creation is not to be irreparably damaged or even destroyed by humans unwittingly deploying our newfound powers in disastrous ways. And then he says, the first responsibility of a conquering army is always to govern. Right, and on this analogy, human beings are the conquering army of the planet, and now all we need, the only possible thing we can do is govern. Anything else would be irresponsible. This, while a kind of a more stark, maybe disturbing analogy to give for the human being's relationship with the natural world, I think does harken back in many ways to this, what we saw in the previous slides, about this idea that human beings in the Anthropocene have this newfound duty to manage, and that old ideas of preserving or letting be are out of date and antiquated. Another example of what I would call a Promethean dream is exemplified by Earl Ellis in his, a lot of what Earl Ellis says, actually. But in this, one example you can give is in this piece, The Planet of No Return, in 2012. He says that our powers may yet exceed our ability to manage them, but there is no alternative except to shoulder the mantle of planetary stewardship. A good, or at least a better, Anthropocene is within our grasp. Creating that future will mean going beyond fears of transgressing natural limits and nostalgic hopes of returning to some pastoral or pristine era. Most of all, we must not see the Anthropocene as a crisis, but as the beginning of a new geological epoch ripe with human-directed opportunity. So again, these themes should, there's echoes to what we've already seen, right? This inevitabilist, no alternative, this dismissal of what he what he calls nostalgic ideas of a Bristol or pristine sort of environment. Rejection we even seen the Anthropocene as a crisis at all, but rather as an opportunity, and a human-directed one, a technological opportunity, an opportunity of control. So in perhaps the most, well, at least politically, maybe influential piece called the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, about 20 or plus scholars came together to write this very technocratic, so that takes the Anthropocene as a framing and then argues for a very, what you might call, growth-centered, technological vision of the future that they think has become inevitable after the advent of the Anthropocene. And by growth, I mean in particular economic growth. So totally throwing aside any perhaps like critiques that see, for instance, it sounds like the next talk in this series is going to be someone who talks about the capitalist scene, who thinks, and that's the idea that we have arrived in the Anthropocene because of capitalism, because of this industrialism and unchecked kind of economic growth. And the Eco-Modernist Manifesto totally rejects that idea. Instead, they write, as scholars, scientists, campaigners, and citizens, we write with the conviction that knowledge and technology applied with wisdom might allow for a good or even great Anthropocene. A good Anthropocene demands that humans use their growing social, economic, and technological powers to make life better for people, stabilize the climate, and protect the natural world. They continue, in this we affirm that humanity must shrink its impacts on the environment to make more room for nature. So they allow that. But they say we reject another, that human societies must harmonize with nature to avoid economic and ecological collapse. Right? To the degree, they go on, to the degree to which there are fixed physical boundaries to human consumption, they are so theoretical to be functionally irrelevant. So a total rejection that the problem is kind of human arrogance or ambition is driving the Anthropocene or our basic systems, but rather that we just kind of have to just go further, right? It's like they see a cliff, right? And I just thought it's an analogy, but it probably kind of works, right? Imagine like a cliff in front of us. You kind of have two options. One, you could either hit the brakes, or what you could do is you see a ramp and you say, well, if we just accelerate fast enough, we might be able to jump the cliff and get to the other side and be totally fine, right? And it seems like they're in favor of that latter option. By the way, of the many kind of co-signers of this manifesto includes Mark Linus and Earl Ellis. Notably, Emma Maris left her name off, which I think shows that her relationship with this thinking, despite playing a kind of critical role in popularizing this kind of rhetoric, is a little bit more nuanced. Okay, so moving on, let's now think about how this could be, some of this rhetoric and some of this thinking might have historical parallels. So in 1909, the Italian painter and intellectual Filippo Tommaso Marinetti wrote this Futurism Manifesto, which was a very kind of, certainly very stark and bold declaration of what he saw as a new aesthetic, befitting what was at the time the new century, 20th century. So he writes that the futurists declare that the splendor of the world has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed. A racing automobile with its bonnet adorned with great tubes like serpents with explosive breath, a roaring motor car which seems to run on machine gun fire. Why should we look over our shoulders when we intend to breach the doors of the impossible? Time and space died yesterday. We are already living in the absolute, since we have already created eternal, omnipresent speed. So one interesting kind of historical and autobiographical fact about Marinetti is he had this really transformative moment, I think when he was in his 20s, I could be wrong with that, when he was in a very early automobile, and I guess there was some bikers ahead of him and he was going too fast and he swerved out of the way to avoid them and had a pretty relatively minor accident. But instead of seeing maybe like the threat of technology or seeing precaution, he saw the power of this new, and was thrilled by the power of this new technology that he was wielding. And he was almost like thought that this accident was just reason to go forward even more. And he was really enraptured by speed. And he thought that this meant that a lot of old ideas that kind of thought that we should slow down in one way or another were totally obsolete. Because as he says, we are already living in the absolute. And so here it also harkens back to this inevitability of the Anthropocene discourse. Notably as well, in a slightly, and I would also just, if you want to kind of just a trip of a read, you should just read the Futurist Manifesto. You can find it online, and it's a lot. It's certainly an entertaining read, I'd say. And there's a lot more that if you look at some of the rhetoric and even the principles that they espouse in that, I think you also see even more examples that I could have given about some of these parallels. But in the interest of time, I will go to this other work, Electrical War, that he wrote in 1911, where he also makes explicit that in this future that he sees of technology and acceleration, that the human nature relationship will be one of domination. So he writes, "We are collaborating with mechanics in destroying the old poetry of distance and wild solitudes, the exquisite nostalgia," there's that word again, "of departure, and in its place we urge the tragic lyricism of ubiquity and omnipresent speed." Okay, so I'm just going to, again, in the interest of time, just summarize what I see, 3 futurist themes that come out in some of the various works of Marinetti, but in particular it's the Futurist Manifesto. So the first theme is that there has been some kind of radical ontological rupture from the past. So the ontological just means like related to the world, right? It concerns existence itself. So there's in some sense, the current existence of the world is fundamentally different than of the past. And in this sense, the is of the now has made obsolete what you might call the oughts of the past. So another maybe less lyrical way of saying that is to say that kind of what has happened with technology and the planet has made what historical thinkers thought we should do totally irrelevant. So as a result, the second theme is that looking to the past for wisdom and instruction has nothing to offer. And then third, pursuing progress, and always defined by a particular vision of positive change, and in Marinetti's case, a particularly undemocratic one, is overridingly important. I think I should acknowledge also that Marinetti, 10 years after the Futurist Manifesto, would go on to co-author the Fascist Manifesto, and so he has links to Italian fascism. I don't think this is an accidental relationship. I'm not going to dive into it, I think, in this talk. But right, if you imagine that this acceleration of the world means that kind of human beings, or particular human beings, need to kind of he describes it as seizing the steering wheel, right? That this is going to enable kind of a concentration of power in particular individuals. Right? Someone kind of needs to take the wheel that he describes. This is also, I think, a real threat of a lot of the discourse we see today by these age of man environmentalists. So what I kind of propose, the basic thesis, is that the Anthropocene provides this ontological rupture that Marinetti also saw the automobile kind of symbolic of. And a lot of this discourse we've been seeing is a rhetoric of rupture. So in the Anthropocene, we live in a totally different world, and so any kind of the fear-mongering or the ideas of we should let be, show restraint, try to restore, protect nature, harmonize with nature, all of these ideals that were particularly kind of important to American environmentalist thought, going back to, well, Thoreau, but also John Muir, who many of you, of course, may be familiar with, given his linkages to California. And Elder Leopold, that these visions are just out of date. And they become out of date because of the Anthropocene. So one kind of way of showing evidence of this is by thinking about what the role geoengineering plays in a lot of these discourses. So I would call geoengineering an Anthropocene technology. So what geoengineering is a catch-all term for a lot of different solutions. There's 2 broad categories, one of carbon dioxide removal and one of solar radiation management. But the most concerning ones that I think are most emblematic of the Anthropocene is something called stratospheric aerosol injection. And this is a technology that seeks to mimic the effect of volcanoes by putting a bunch of aerosols into the stratosphere. Traditionally, it was thought that there should be sulfur particles or aerosols. And then this would circulate around the entire Earth and have a cooling effect. Just like when a volcano explodes, there was traceable, distinct cooling around the planet for as long as a year. So, again, you wouldn't think necessarily that this particular idea of a solution for climate change should have any particular relationship to the idea of the Anthropocene, but that's just not true. You see people who are advocates of at least researching this technology ubiquitously invoking the Anthropocene. So Paul Crutzen, in Geology of Mankind, right? Remember, this is like the original paper that kind of initially kind of proliferated this into the public, into like especially academic world, right? Remember the 2000 exchange, that was just at a conference. That was in a very kind of small cohort. This is the paper that kind of more popularized it. Even when he was first suggesting the Anthropocene, he thought that it was not merely descriptive, because at the end of this paper, he suggests we might have to geoengineer. He writes, "A daunting task lies ahead for scientists and engineers to guide society towards environmentally sustainable management during the era of the Anthropocene. This will require appropriate human behavior at all scales, and may well involve internationally accepted large-scale geoengineering projects, for instance, to optimize climate." So since many other thinkers have also kind of echoed this basic sentiment, one of the most recent, which is actually a colleague of mine now at Princeton, and one of the most famous philosophers alive today, Peter Singer, also endorsed this basic sentiment recently. So in his piece, "Should We Research Geoengineering?" he actually describes how he's changed his mind. So previously, and I think around the time, so in the early aughts, or not the early aughts, in 2011, when some of these initial kind of Age of Man environmentalists were getting their word out, Singer was actually against researching geoengineering. He thought that this was just a bad solution. But he's changed his mind. He writes in this short piece, "Early critics dismissed geoengineering as playing God, an objection that misfires when addressed to those who do not believe that a divine being is safeguarding the fate of the planet. A more secular version of the objection might state that we should leave nature alone. But," and this is what he claimed, that battle was lost decades ago. We humans have already overwhelmed nature, to such an extent that many scientists suggest that we are now in a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene." So there that is again. So this is something you also can't unsee once you notice it. So I'm going to be, as you can tell from my tone, probably, I'm very critical of a lot of these rhetorical appeals. But I think one way of kind of defanging some of or just showing and revealing how erroneous and kind of unconvincing some of these appeals should be, is to actually think back to the sort of context in which those original, especially, I'm just talking about the American environmental context here, the sort of things, phenomena they were observing, and what triggered this initial idea that maybe we should show restraints and pursue alternate economic systems, and refuse this Promethean dream. So I'm going to give the example of Henry David Thoreau, right? So he lived in Maine. So one of his famous quotes, this is Thoreau here, his famous quote where he said that, "I went to the woods, Walden Pond, because I wished to live deliberately, to confront only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what I had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discovered that I had not lived." So fundamentally, and I'm going to have to go quickly through Thoreau here, his vision was that we could learn and be transformed by wild nature in ways that actually kind of rendered stark how short-sighted and ultimately kind of trivial a lot of the technologies of his time that he saw were. So one thing that's really important to remember, though, is think about what was Thoreau's nature. So what was he witnessing around him? So also, as a brief aside, especially for those who maybe are familiar with Thoreau at all, you probably heard some people actually caricaturing Thoreau and even dismissing Thoreau by saying, "Oh, Thoreau, Walden Pond, where he retreated to, that was very close to Concord. It was only a short half an hour walk. In fact, this is what you hear a lot. He even brought his clothes back to his mother to get washed for once in a while." And this is a way of just totally kind of discarding what Thoreau had to say. But in fact, this increasing hybridization and getting into the relatively wild, although not pure wilderness, something he didn't actually talk about very much, of Walden Pond, one thing that it allowed him to do was, again, kind of be exposed to wild agencies in a way he was not able to in Concord. But he was not ignorant of the evidence of humanity. In fact, this is what really triggered his retreat, and thinking that we need this desire of him to kind of engage more with wild nature. So importantly, right, a railroad ran by Walden Pond. His nearby neighbors heated China tea on stoves fueled by coal. The nearby woods were being clear-cut and were totally clear-cut by the time of his death in the 1860s, 1862. And importantly, the nearby rivers were dammed and powered cotton mills. So this is the nature that Thoreau saw. And in this sense, when he's writing about the importance of wild nature and challenging technology, this is a reaction to this early evidence of the Anthropocene that we see today. One fun fact is actually in one of his lesser read pieces. Walden is by far the most read. It's a wonderful book. I'd highly recommend everyone read it. In another book he wrote called Journeys on the Merrimack and Concord Rivers, I think that's what it's called, he actually describes and endorses an early form of what you might call eco-sabotage. He sees the dams on this river, he sees how it negatively impacts the fish on the river, and how it prevents them from going back to their kind of spawning place, their ancestral spawning places, and he suggests that it might be better for humans or some human being to just destroy the dam and let the river flow freely and let the fish go back through. So, very prescient thinker. So, when Thoreau celebrated wildness, which you might understand as kind of those non-human agencies, world that is outside of human technology, world not dominated, the nature not dominated by humanity, he didn't see it as a pure, pristine, totally separate world, but as one that was fundamentally relational in the sense it had to do with, it was kind of a give and take with human beings, and it could exist both in Walden Pond and Mount Katahdin, where he actually had his most significant exposure to overwhelmingly wild nature, that he actually was like, okay, this is too much, I gotta go back to Walden. So it's relative and it's relational. The wild, as I've hinted at, grants perspective, it enables personal and political transformation, and that ultimately at the heart of Walden is a rejection of the managerial ethos of what I might call the Anthropocene economy. This is a very similar way to put, I think, what the next speaker will talk about, which is the Capitalocene. The idea of kind of a growth-centered economy predicated on free trade, that this really had horrible effects on his nearby environments that we've seen just explode today at a global scale. That Thoreau saw early signs of this and thought, we need something else. Let's see, what's my next slide? Okay. And he thought that what kind of our industry and our technology make us forget is that we're not always the best judges of what we want in the first place. So what technology as a form of control allows human beings to kind of just say, I want this, I want more food, right? I want more digital satisfaction, I want to be warmer or colder at any given moment. That even if this is this relationship with the world that we have arrived at in the Anthropocene, that we forget alternatives that might even be more rich. So he writes that so thoroughly and sincerely are we compelled to live, reverencing our life, that we deny the possibility of change. This is the only way, we say, but there are as many ways to live as there can be drawn radii from one center. All change is a miracle to contemplate, but it is a miracle which is taking place every instant. So one thing that Thoreau also said, hold off on the slide for a moment. One thing Thoreau also said, which I think is the best critique of technology and most powerful and convincing that you can make, especially of an overly technocratic solution to any problem. He said that our technologies are improved means to an unimproved end, and one that was already too easy to arrive at. And so this is ultimately what he saw that he thought was stark by the early Anthropocene economy that he saw surrounding him. Another really just wonderful quote that I think really captures the essence of Walden, which I would like to share, is in this wonderful biography of Thoreau by Lord Asa Wells, who's an English scholar. She writes, "Bending Walden towards a cycle of rebirth meant opening it to seasonal change in the ways that living in season alters the rhythm of living and thinking. As winter drives life into a corner, it proves not mean but rich and warm. The narrator surrounds his hearth with visitors, including the freed slaves and impoverished laborers whose circle he has joined, and the brute neighbors who shelter beside him. Like the wasps he accepts until they disappear into the cracks. The human economy of his first chapter thus enlarges to a new concept, not economia or management of the household, but ecologia, ecology, the speaking of the household, composed of 1,000 voices, mice and wasps, rabbits and squirrels, jays and chickadees, and also his human friends." This framing of Walden might also help some of you get past the first chapter of Walden, which is called Economy, and I have it on first account from several of my friends that they tried to start reading Walden and couldn't get past the first chapter, which admittedly, it's called Economy, it's a bit of a slog, but understanding what the project of the book is in this way really shows that this was a really important part of the book, because it's what Thoreau is ultimately trying to critique. Instead of the management of this whole household, technocratic solutions to environmental problems, we should start listening to other voices, non-human, all of the other people that we are killing and destroying and harming with our environmental destruction, and stop focused on narrow vision, on a particular flavor of the good. This is why Thoreau's wildness is should be seen as a liberatory ethic. You can see wildness as for the non-human, what freedom is for the human. So I'm going to close up briefly here. So, the Anthropocene, a flight from history. So what can we learn from this very brief survey of Thoreau and Walden? I think we can learn some lessons from this early Anthropocene writer and thinker. So the first thing we should notice is that this idea of what this rampant anthropogenic human-caused environmental impact should teach us was radically different for Thoreau than it was for a lot of these other thinkers we surveyed, these age-man environmentalists. Right. The descriptive referent, this purely scientific idea, despite some of these debates about where do we exactly put the beginning of the Anthropocene, the basic phenomena of humans drastically impacting the planet is nothing new at all. Some people think that the Anthropocene can start way back. And no one's thinking about the normative lessons to be learned. Right? And so this urge to dismiss historical thinking as antiquated is fundamentally backwards and misconceived. Because it's these early kind of reactions that we should take most seriously from those who maybe weren't actually quite as used to this destroyed environment as we are. Maybe we should take these early estimations of these impacts more seriously. Moreover, the point is there's more than one ethical attitude one can adopt regarding the advent of the Anthropocene and Anthropocene's effects. So this idea that we should jump right from the descriptive, a scientific fact, to a specific ethical outlook, and one that's totally inevitable and unavoidable, is totally erroneous. It's not a cogent argument to make. And finally, I think we should say that because the wildness that Thoreau celebrated, right? This was a canonical thinker, arguably wilderness, like one scholar wrote that all wilderness thinking flowed in Walden's wake, right? This book was absolutely like canonical for environmental thinking. John Muir was deeply inspired by it, but this wasn't an interaction with wilderness that you have to go into the, maybe today to Alaska, to these farthest reaches that are the least impacted by humans. Thoreau was celebrating wildness in a place that was very humanized, but he thought it could still teach us something. Likewise, we can recognize that wildness is still very much going to be a part of the Anthropocene. The question is, are we going to just continue to try to dominate it with all the consequences that has wrought in the past, or are we going to try to work with it? So my upshot of this talk is that revisiting Thoreau serves as therapy to what I think is an arrogant technophilic, just a love of technology, futurism that is rampant in Anthropocene rhetoric. That I suggest that the way forward is to reconcile historical sensibilities with changing circumstances, not to just jettison one or the other. We shouldn't just ignore how the world's changing. We shouldn't just reject the thinking of historical philosophers and scientists, uncritically, right? And this above approach that is described invites us to leave futurism in the past and the Anthropocene with it. And therefore, I really think that given the role that this Anthropocene plays rhetorically for so many people, at the very least we should regard it with suspicion when it is invoked, and perhaps actively resisted, given that it's so serving this one particular vision of how to solve our environmental problems, and one that is deeply controversial and, I think, misinformed. Okay, that's it. Thank you all. So yeah, I think we have a little bit of time for questions. I managed that okay.
And I can bring the mic around.
Arthur, did you get a chance to make it up to the park?
I did not.
Oh, you would have loved it. Sequoia National Park.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
I really
If you get a chance before you leave. I'm not sure I understood enough of your talk, so I don't know if this is an objection to roughly what you were saying, or whether I'm actually agreeing with your conclusion, so you tell me. I was trying to situate myself in all of this, because I'm not steeped in the literature, so I'm listening, I'm trying to figure out where my views fit. Why couldn't someone label themselves something like a technocratic or technophilic futurist in service to preservation, something like that? Once we have these new energy sources, we can get rid of cars, we can get rid of the highways and parking lots, we can, and so on, using technology in an optimistic way. Once we colonize Mars and the Moon, we can start returning the Earth to its original state, and so on.
Yeah, so I think that's open. And in fact, I think there's depending on who you're talking about, there's a little bit of evidence of this. So we saw a little kind of sprinkle of this in the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, where they say, oh, what we can do is if we just the more efficient, the more technologies that we develop, we can actually just kind of perhaps siphon off human beings into a very a small area, and just leave maybe leave some of the other area to wild animals. So that's, I think, consistent with what I would still think a very kind of. So there's two replies. So the first thing is that still wouldn't show that this rhetoric of the Anthropocene, that this kind of this inevitablist, there's all this kind of radical environmental change around us, so kind of historical thinkers should be abandoned, right? That we do see kind of throughout, right? This is just the rhetoric that I'm describing. It doesn't have to be this way, but this is just how people use kind of the arguments that people make. Let's see. Right, that rhetoric is still problematic either way. I also think that there's different flavors, I think, what you could still call age of man environmentalism. There's some that are a little bit more kind of more modest, who think that we still need to like manage the planet, whatever that means, kind of leaving it a little bit more open, still seem kind of technocratic, but are like at least slightly more humble towards like the role that technologies might play, and realize that we should be perhaps like skeptical of geoengineering, for instance, because it might go wrong. But as a rule, a lot of these folks just are, I think, very kind of just trumpeting technology in ways that is criticizable either way. So you can still criticize someone who, even if they think, okay, we can leave nature alone afterwards, doesn't mean that it's not going to make the problem worse, right? Thoreau thought that it was this alienation from nature that technology enables, and this arrogant kind of pursuit of specific ends that was the problem. And that still is not being challenged by that kind of route. And that also kind of echoes my hesitation with it, which would just be that, are we going to really care about nature and wild animals in a world in which we are just totally isolated from them? Arguably, you need these kind of interactions to have empathy with the more than human in the world, right? So I would suggest instead of that, we should try to rewild our cities, encourage the more life in places, especially the more urban areas. Try to invite the wildlife back in. Most of these cities are in places, right? They're good for humans. That's why we built all of these cities. They're also really good for animals. They tend to be around water and very actually like what could be a bountiful area. And so a lot of the animals still try to get there for that reason, but we just make a place so unhospitable for them. So if we're able to actually change our cities in a way that invites them in, it will actually encourage that sort of human, non-human interaction that I think will benefit way more than trying to isolate ourselves. So, but I'll still say, I think you could have that view. I still think it's criticizable, and it can still be futuristic in a, problematic way. A little long-winded, so I'll try to keep my next answer shorter.
So I'm also not really up on the environmentalist, but I'm gonna, basically my environmental exposure is Silent Spring. So
Mhm.
where do you fit, I mean, Silent Spring, it's the book in, I think it's in the 60s, that she
64,
publishes, where she
I don't know.
basically is like,
52.
hey, all the birds are gone, we've been poisoning our planet with pesticides,
Yeah.
so where does that fit in this range of?
So Rachel Carson, so actually my broader dissertation, which is, I think, you can see hints throughout this talk, maybe more than a hint. I argue that like the main kind of ethos, right, the ethic, the heart of especially preservationism, American preservationism, right, so exemplified by John Muir, is something like, is humility. Both I would, and I, for the purpose of this, I think is, especially Carson's work, technological humility being a really important one, right? So Carson she described pesticides as a caveman's club. That's how she describes it in that book. She thinks it's just human beings that see, okay, I don't like these bugs here, so I'm just gonna throw poison at it. And they do it in a very ham-fisted way that doesn't recognize that it's going to kill and harm a lot of other organisms that might actually be very conducive. Right? Even if you just take the basic economic ends of human beings as valuable to pursue, which of course you could be critical of, and I think Carson was certainly critical, it's still self-undermining. And so that would be a critique, a very severe critique of this age of man environmentalist ethos. This idea that we need to manage more, be more technocratic, use more technologies, is just an arrogant Promethean enterprise. It overstates our ability to control nature, right? Trying to master nature is wrong because it's just going to fail. And so let's just not try. Let's try to just work with and actually live in harmony, so to speak, as cliche as that might sound, with nature, right? Something that the Eco-Modernist Manifesto explicitly rejected. We should not be trying to harmonize ourselves. We should just be trying to basically, in the most charitable reading, I think, describe to you exactly what was just suggested, try to master nature to the benefit of non-human animals. And also in some of Carson's other work, she has this really wonderful, very short essay on wonder. That actually that was gonna be her next book, but she died. But she has an essay on wonder that is now published on a book. And so Carson really thought, like, in a more profound sense, that we need wonder in the world to be taken by the other than us in the wild, as a way of kind of, I think, humbling us, even our moral beliefs too, and what we think is like one vision of the good, right? To quote Thoreau, there's as many ways to live as radii from a center of a circle, right? So I think Carson would be highly skeptical of age-of-man environmentalism and would recommend both technological humility but also moral humility itself. Yeah.
I think I'm good. Oh, here.
It's helpful for the
Oh, okay.
One of the things that strikes me about your talk is your skepticism about our ability to manage, and that includes professionals and people that are making decisions. It seems like the interests of the few outweigh any consideration along the lines of environmentalism. We see this all the time, Love Now, all these other places that have just been destroyed. So, to me, this whole idea of age of man and the idea that we can engineer our way out of this situation, to do that, you have to understand the whole situation. You have to understand how the planet works. And I don't think we're doing a good job of that. I think there's unintended consequences every time that we try and stick up some new technological solution. But I do think, and I agree with you, there's answers back throughout history about how to set up sustainable lives, and we just don't do that. What's your answer to that? How do we get past the systemic drive to not do any of these things that you're suggesting?
Yeah, it's obviously really really tough, right? I think I know this is, and I should place it, but I think at least part of it we need at least is what you might call like a politics of imagination. At least imagine that there's other ways, right? There's actually forgetting who it was. There's a famous quote that some of you may have heard from Moog Fisher, Capitalist Realism, I think 2009. He has a quote where he says, might miss it, he says, like, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And I think that's true, and it makes it really a really tough problem, right? If in one way or another capitalism, especially kind of unchecked capitalism, is a problem, it's also true that a lot of people say that it's also here to stay, there's no getting away from it, and so we just have to work with what we have. And so at least resisting those narratives, resisting this easy rhetoric, I think has a role to say that, really be skeptical. Like when people say, well, what are you in the Anthropocene? So we have to geoengineer, or we have to, just go all in on just purely investing in green energy or electric cars, without any kind of future about who is this benefiting and further discussions, and recognizing that maybe we need to actually reduce our energy use, right? Not just try to meet ever-increasing demand. Just a very kind of stark example of this. I mean, okay, I could give so many. I mean, the Hetch Hetchy case is like a really important historical analog of this, right? Where many of you probably know this, hopefully, but there's this conflict between John Muir, famous environmentalist, and Gifford Pinchot, who was much more of a kind of an early adopter, I would argue, of this sort of age of man environmentalist ethos. Maybe not using the Anthropocene, but thinking what we need is to manage the environment just in the interest of human beings. But it's purely like, it's not embracing the value of wild nature. It's just in a purely like, we need to not just cut down all the trees because we need at least some for next year. Anyway, like there's this really heated debate over whether to dam Hetch Hetchy and Yosemite National Park, and Gifford Pinchot won. But a lot of like the rhetoric was like, well, what are you going to have, right? Are you just going to let San Francisco just not have water, right? Are people just going to die? Is that the only option? So it's always framed as like, either we dam this beautiful valley or a bunch of people die, right? And if you actually go to Hetch Hetchy today, you won't see one mention of this debate there. And you also will just see all the benefits about all this water, how it provides San Francisco. What they won't tell you is, at the beginning, when they were having these debates in the politics in San Francisco at the time, someone said, well, why are we doing this? why can't we, right? So the argument was that you could get water. There's other ways. There's actually a lot of ways of getting water around San Francisco. But the other ways that you could were privately owned, and they were charging a lot of money for anyone who wanted to use their water. And so one of the politicians at the time said, well, why don't we just force them to not do that? Why don't we just say you cannot charge these rates for water? And they decided not to do that. They decided instead we're going to dam this natural place and, tunnel this water, not tunnel literally, but, send this water however many miles to San Francisco. Because it's free, because it's, at the time, it was all about unregulated capitalism, right, in the free market. And so we can't just prevent these people from using this, right? And there's, I think, there's analogs of Hetch Hetchy all over the place today. One of the most kind of, I think, clear ones is the Salt Lake right now. The way that it's being, this greater basin is being totally siphoned off. All the water is being taken away before it can actually fill the Great Salt Lake, which not only is a really important bird refugee, but if it dries up, it's going to poison the whole surrounding population. But at the same time, Salt Lake City is ever growing. They're planning, their city plan says we're just going to keep growing, we're going to double in size by 2050. And yes, where are we going to get water? How are we going to feed all these people? I mean, give water to all these people. Their proposal, well, one proposal, not the only one, is to build a pipeline down from the Gulf of Mexico and just pipe the water to Salt Lake. And that's the solution that we come up with. That's not the only one. So I think politics of imagining alternatives, and just resisting these kind of those are the best examples I can give, but it's going to require democracy and vigilance and hard work. There's no simple solutions.
So this is currently still in the realm of basically science fiction as it stands, but there has been recent talk about the idea of reintroducing extinct species of animals that are, as far as we know, like with the passenger pigeon, absolutely human responsibility, as well as some others that may or may not have been human responsibility, such as mammoths. What do you think, or what is your opinion on the usage of technology not to control Earth, but to revert the ecosystem to a pre-mankind involvement state?
Yeah, it's another tough question. De-extinction, as it's often called, is definitely controversial. I certainly have mixed feelings about it. I think, one thing I will just grant is I'm not fully anti-technology in the sense that I think all intervention or all even control in one place, right, is wrong all the time, right? If you use, for instance, if you use this kind of technocratic, new technology to recreate a species, and that increases wildness, right, in the sense of what you care about is more wild nature. I think that's consistent. I think, at least in principle, it could be ethical. And this is what I'm an advocate of rewilding generally, and you can take Yellowstone as an exemplar of this, and reintroducing wolves. That did take a lot of intervention. You had to collar all these wolves and forcibly relocate them. Right? That's an impingement on wildness, which could be seen as part of the problem, but it was in the service of wildness, and so I don't think that's kind of out of bounds necessarily at all. And you can make a similar argument for de-extinction for a similar reason. You still have to be careful, of course, of unintended consequences. I think the biggest arguments maybe against it that I see is one, some people are really worried about before there was something really powerful about extinction. I mean, ironically, rhetorically, but also I think emotionally and morally for environmentalists, because when a species is gone, you think it's just gone, it's gone forever, and that has profound. The profound loss of that, with the passenger pigeon, saying this incredibly abundant species that literally just blotted out the sun because of how innumerable the populations were. We have killed them. That life is no longer here. If you start promising we can just bring them back, there's this risk of cheapening that loss, and I think that's a real worry. And I think kind of related to that is we have to really be careful about thinking that you really can bring them back in the first place, and not just from a genetic level. This might be controversial, but basically, you might think the species as it existed was more than its genetics. It was a community, and right, it had this relationship with one another and the environment, and that has fundamentally changed. So even if we do bring back this genetic creature, doesn't mean we're bringing back the real, like at least the thing as it was, and it really doesn't undermine that great devastating loss, but I think people still might think it will. And so that's my biggest concern with that technology, but I don't think I'd rule it out full stop, but I'm really, yeah, it makes me nervous.
Say one last question, if there is one. Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks everyone.
So I'll be here by the door, and I just have to go get them by my seat, and I'll have tickets, proof of attendance. Thanks.